One Just World, Think, Talk, Act on Global Poverty and Development. This initiative is sponsored by the Australian Government's International Development Agency, AusAid, in partnership with the International Women's Development Agency and World Vision Australia. Tonight, these organisations have joined up with a university partner. In this case, it's the University of Sydney. And we're delighted to see you here tonight for our forum, Should We Give Aid to Countries Whose Governments Are Corrupt? Governance, Corruption and World Poverty. But before we commence proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Respecting the rights and contributions of Indigenous peoples has become an increasingly important part of international development. One Just World is not just about providing a platform for ideas and discussion about important development and human rights issues and how they might be able to be addressed. It also enables you to ask questions of people who are directly involved in the whole business of development. Some people, of course, coming from countries overseas, some have worked overseas, some have taken a real academic interest in the subject. So this is not just a platform for us to project out our ideas from here, but we're very keen to get feedback and questions from you in the second half of the proceedings tonight. I'd just like to point out that should you ask a question, note that all of the proceedings tonight are being recorded. And also, if you'd like to tweet about the forum tonight, the hashtag is OJW. And we do hope that tonight we can have some tweeting going on. It's my great pleasure to welcome our 5 distinguished guests who are here this evening. Each of them has a different insight, a different background, a different experience of the sorts of issues that we're going to discuss. The whole connection of corruption and aid, the whole issue of good governments, bad governments. All of these people are very, very experienced. But first of all, let me apologise for the absence of Mr. Tim Costello. Unfortunately, Tim couldn't make it tonight, and he sends his apologies. A great supporter, of course, of this whole series, and we're very disappointed he couldn't make it tonight. But unfortunately, he for reasons of domestic factors, he couldn't make it with us. Replacing Tim tonight is Joanna Hayter, who's the Executive Director of the International Women's Development Agency. Joanna has been working in the international aid and community development sector for 25 years. Her former roles include Resident Country Director in Myanmar and Vietnam and Regional Director for Southern Africa for international NGOs. In November 2010, she became the Executive Director of International Women's Development Agency based in Melbourne. And of course, that's an international agency that focuses entirely on women and girls. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joanna Hayter. Our next guest, and we're delighted that she's with us tonight, is Dr. Hataifa Sajafudian, who's a member of the Indonesian Parliament representing the Golongan Karya Party. She graduated from the Department of Regional and City Planning at the Bandung Institute of Technology in Indonesia, received her MPP, Master of Public Policy, from Singapore, but most importantly, her PhD from Flinders University in Adelaide. A truly wonderful international education. She's the author of a book, Innovation, Participation and Good Governance, Participatory Initiatives in Indonesia, and we're very keen to hear from her about the role that engagement can play in meeting this challenge. She's very strong as a voice for promoting Indonesian women's participation in politics. Hataifa, welcome to Australia and to our forum tonight. Jane Ellis has been an active member of the Australian chapter of Transparency International since 1996, and with the exception of a couple of years, has been on the board there since 2001. As a director, Jane has been involved in regional discussions on corruption and has represented Transparency International Australia at national and international conventions and forums. She's worked with Australia's federal government agencies and also international development contractors. For her day job, she's a special counsel with the law firm Blake Dawson, where she specialises in competition and consumer law. Welcome to Jane. Our next guest is Satish Chand. He's a professor of finance in the School of Business at the University of New South Wales, based in Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Born and bred in Fiji, he's now very much involved in academic life in Australia as the adjunct professor in the Crawford School of Economics and Government at the Australian National University. His interests include labour migration, fragile states and the challenges of development. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Satish Chand. Last but definitely not least, we have Matt Wade, who's a senior writer for the Sydney Morning Herald, who recently returned to Australia after a 3-year posting based in New Delhi as the South Asia correspondent for the Herald and the Age newspapers. Most importantly, Matt also worked in the aid and development field, including a 2-year stint based with NGOs in India. Please give a warm welcome to Matt Wade. Well, I hope that we'll have a very interesting discussion this evening. We'll be, as I said, encouraging you to ask questions later on in the evening. But I want to move through the proceedings in an orderly way and hopefully in a systematic way. I suppose being an academic, I like to start with the basic questions and then move through to the content of the issue and discuss it more deeply. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start proceedings by asking each of our guests a question that relates to their interests but also helps inform us of some of the important issues. And they'll have about 5 minutes to answer those questions, and then we'll probably follow up on that for some more minutes afterwards and then open it up to all of you as the audience. But in order to keep things moving, I think it's important that we go straight to these foundation questions that relate to this issue of the relationship between aid and corruption. It's a very interesting and important question. Some people say in our community we shouldn't give aid because we can't guarantee that it'll produce the results that we want. Some people say aid is good in itself, independently of whether or not it has a positive or a negative impact in the fight against corruption. And some people say that it actually can assist in the fight against corruption. Some say marginally, some say significantly. So there's a lot of opinions on this subject. And I think it's important and very encouraging that we've got such a distinguished group of people to help us answer those questions. Now, let's go to perhaps the base question that we might deal with when discussing corruption, and I'll go to Jane. Jane, of course, has worked with Transparency International, and therefore I think it's appropriate that I ask her, how do we define corruption, but just as importantly, how do we measure corruption? And is there consensus on the questions of definition and measurement?
Thank you. All very tricky questions, Jeff. Corruption itself is defined very broadly as abusing a public position to acquire private gain. And what I might just do before I actually proceed with the rest of Jeff's question is just talk a little bit about Transparency International itself, because it is actually quite closely linked to concerns about corruption, and particularly corruption as it impacts on aid or vice versa. Now, Transparency International was set up by somebody called Peter Eigen, who used to work for the World Bank. And in 1993, he left the World Bank because he was very frustrated with the fact that a lot of monies were going to developing countries, and rather than actually finding their way to the people who actually needed it, there was actually finding their way, or those monies were finding their way into private bank accounts in Switzerland and elsewhere. The way Transparency International actually is structured is that it's essentially an umbrella organization, and it's reliant upon the citizens of each country identifying the need for to tackle corruption in that particular country and setting up essentially a chapter of Transparency International in that country. So in Australia, we have the Australian chapter of Transparency International that was established by Australian citizens. In Fiji, there is a Fijian chapter of Transparency International that was established by Fijians. It's the same in Papua New Guinea and all the other countries where we have a chapter, and we have well over 100 chapters now around the world. One of the first tools that Transparency International actually developed was something called the Corruption Perceptions Index. And the Corruption Perceptions Index is, as it's described, is a perception of conducted or acquired through a range of surveys as to how business people in particular perceive a country's level of corruption. Now, when this first started in the 1990s, it was rather rudimentary. The base of it, though, was that there had to be at least 3 surveys conducted by Transparency International relevant to a particular country that were robust surveys, and that then could actually be used to measure the level of perceptions of corruption. Through that Corruptions Perception Index, they started to actually release on an annual basis a revised version. As time has gone on, that particular perception or that index has become more sophisticated, and the methods used to actually measure corruption has become more sophisticated. However, it's still very much determined on a perception basis, and that's primarily because, as you can probably imagine, corruption is not always something that's done publicly. People don't tend to post how much money they've acquired or through corrupt processes, and people don't actually divulge whether or not they've actually engaged in corrupt conduct. So inevitably, it relies on people being involved in businesses in particular countries saying, well, this is the experience that we've had, this is who's required a payment of money or so a percentage of a particular contract, this is how high up it goes, which then determines the level of corruption that's actually perceived to be in that country. On the flip side, there's also another perceptions or another index called the Bribe Payers Index. This doesn't come out quite so frequently. It's not annual. It tends to be every 3 years at the moment. And in this case, government officials are actually asked to identify the nationals of which countries are likely to be most likely to offer bribes to government officials. And there's only about 26 countries because clearly they focus on those countries that have the most trade at this stage. So in a sense, that's where I suppose the Corruption Perceptions Index is at, and the Bribe Payers Index as well. The Corruption Perceptions Index, however, has become very important to a lot of the private sector who are seeking to actually invest in developing countries, and they'll use that as part of their risk analysis before they decide whether or not to actually invest in a country. And I think overall it also has a flow-on effect too into aid, because then government officials in the donor countries look at that to determine how much checks and balances you need to put on to ensure that aid monies are spent appropriately.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're starting to answer the question already in a sense, because transparency, which puts the light on an issue, already starts to impact upon people who give aid, and of course it has an impact on the individual countries themselves that have the spotlight put on them. So transparency is a very important issue, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more this evening. The other issue, of course, that comes up in respect of aid and corruption and development is the issue of the interests and aspirations of women in our world. And I'd like to ask Joanna, can she give us an example where gender might be relevant to our discussion on corruption and governance? Rather than talk generally about this issue, let's put gender into the equation. And can you give us some examples, Joanna, of where that really can be shown to impact?
I can. Thank you, Jeff. And by the way, I'm very happy for the whole world to call me Jo. That's generally how I'm known. Look, I think before I step into a gender lens on this, I think if we're looking for a case study to discuss aid delivery in the context of governance and corruption, I'd like to recommend Burma, number 1. I was living in Burma, or Myanmar, as we refer to it when we are living in that country, for a couple of years as the country director for one of very few international NGOs or donor agencies that were actually present and resident in that country. It was a great experience in terms of drawing on all your resources as a development worker. But this is a nation where every aspect of state governance is corrupted. This is starting from a base of constitutional corruption. It's an incredible situation to find yourself working in. It's a complete exercise of military power across all decision-making and all gatekeeping roles, and I mean from the central capitals right through to the village government structures where everybody is appointed rather than elected. To give you a context of what I mean by constitutional corruption, 51% of the current budget, the national budget for that nation, is directed towards the military. 3% is directed towards health. 3%, by the way, is equivalent to less than $100 per person per year towards health services. Now, if 51% of the national budget is directed towards military, but where constitutionally no questions can be asked about the military spending, even by the Parliament, we have a very serious case of transparency indeed. So the question comes to us, how can we work with nations such as Burma to ensure that we can address all of those really dire and very real humanitarian needs? And I think to say, well, we don't work with the government is just too simple. I think what we're looking at from the perspective of tonight is to think about and start to address those factors that work in countering corruption. And two examples of that, I think, are certainly looking at civil society linkages and, of course, finding other avenues for delivery of aid or development programs themselves. And so what I'd like to do is sort of ask you to think a little bit about this in terms of gender equality. Because it's very clear to us at the International Women's Development Agency that the more pronounced the inequality between men and women, the more vulnerable women are to the impacts of corruption on a nation's development. Let me guide you through that a little. If we see the allocation of all funding and resources is totally controlled, in this case by a male military mindset, then we see a complete vacuum emerge in terms of social services or access to resources for all members of the population, men and women alike. And if we can't get access or services that meet our basic needs, let alone our higher levels and more complex levels of human rights, then we are forced to find other avenues to gain access. And as one example, you start to see pictures of sexual exploitation starting to emerge. What are the parallels? What are the other avenues that give us some way to address our basic needs, some way to find access to the resources or the decisions we need to enable our life to progress? Sexual favours and sexual exploitations is a very well-known example, very well documented across all of the continents on this planet, and I'm not just talking about rich and poor, least developed, it involves all of us. But we start to see an example where you use alternative strategies and parallel strategies, equally corrupt strategies, that brings short-term results and enables access. This is an exercise of power. It is a corrupted power. So I think that in the context of tonight's discussion, what I'd like to explore a little is the synergy, I guess, between what works for gender equality and what works for countering corruption. And I guess the bottom line, just to try and wrap this up a bit, is that if we want to avert corruption and we want to promote good governance, then we have to address the enabling conditions for corruption that are gendered. And these are the sorts of conditions, if we're addressing them, you would find that they are in fact the same sets of conditions that would also enable gender equality to emerge. I want to finish with just leaving three words with you, the words of openness, transparency and fairness as relates to us as individuals as much as it does to nationhood and as much as it does to good governance. And I'll just
a quick follow-up question on Burma or Myanmar. Given that it's a country that's very isolated and decisions have been made in many companies and governments not to give any assistance because of the regime there, do you think that lessens the chances for civil society to develop or improves their chances?
Well, I think there's parallels, and I think that in the context of tonight's discussion, I think that those development players that are present in Myanmar understand fully the importance of developing, investing, supporting, and providing all support to civil society. In the main, what you see is when it comes to corporate sector, that is a sector that has vested interest and integral links with a military regime. But there is no question in my mind whatsoever that what we can do in relationship to civil society is the key to transparency and fairness and gender equality in future.
Latifa, you of course come from Indonesia, and Indonesia's had major changes in its system of governance over the last couple of decades. Recently, a directly elected president for your country. There's been a major decentralisation of power process. The country is democratised. There's huge participation in the political system, and yet, we know that there's also corruption. From your point of view, given the initiatives that have been taken in Indonesia in recent years, particularly with the KPK, the Corruption Commission, and the support that people have given that commission in its work, is it making a difference?
Let me first tell you, I think you are right that in the last 13 years, we change our governance system. I think we developed many new regulations. We have new laws about anti-corruption. We also set up the KPK, the Corruption Eradication Commissions. We decentralize our government system. And lots of things happen also in terms of gender equality. More women in the parliament, from 11% to 18%. And because of the reforms, the pressure from the people, we change everything. That is also why I moved from my activities in the civil society, and then I enter politics, because I think there is more opportunity for us to change something from inside. But related to your questions, very unfortunate to tell you, because before I came here, I talked to one expert on corruption. He also previously like a chairperson of KPK. What do you think? Because I feel very uncertain whether our corruption level is increased or not. Because based on my experience in the parliament, you also see from the newspaper, so many corrupt practices happen everywhere, including in the judiciary or the law enforcement institutions themselves. So it's, and unfortunately, the man said that, in short, it is increasing. So it's very unbelievable. I mean, how can a new, more democratic system cannot influence corrupt behavior, corrupt practices in the country? And before I came to the parliament, I tried to support many local governments to increase their capacity and try to innovate something that is will increase transparency in the regions. Most of the activities supported by donors' money, and it creates many change at the local levels. But when the local government themselves try to do the same thing, using, for example, the same amount of money or maybe higher than the donors' money, most of them are failed. So it means that money is not everything. You need experience, you need assistance, you need friends, you need pressures. That is why it's very important to involve, for the local government to involve NGOs also. So the new type of NGOs needed not only ones who always protesting, but also providing assistance, and give solutions or alternative way of doing your governance. And what happened in the parliament now, it's very sad, yeah, to say that. I really hope that the parliament support also anti-corruption activities. But when you check what happened to KPK, for example, because KPK is very, I think it's very good in doing its job, and people love KPK. But the parliament support very little funding to KPK. Maybe it's only 570 billion rupiah. It's very, very little money. And KPK only have 700 staff to do all the things in the whole country. So it's very little. And it planned to increase their staff to 10,000 in the next several years. But means that they need also support, like funding support. That is why now many foreign countries assistance are needed, and they support KPK, including KPK's support for the parliament. So now KPK not only do like a repressive activities, but also preventive. And I think it's much more important. For example, to provide anti-corruption curriculum in the in schools as well as universities, and if your country, Australia, for example, provide more opportunities for young generations to come here, like what happened to me several years ago, so that I have more opportunities to see and feel, more fair and more transparent system, relatively, because based on your index, Australia is 8 point something, and Indonesia is 2 point something, so it means that you are much higher, in your corruption perception index. So we have to learn from your countries, and I really hope that this forum will, instead of giving you, or threaten you that your money will be corrupted in Indonesia, please support us, to improve our governance, because what is good in our country will also make your country good, I believe. Thank you.
Satish, as someone who's studied development at very close quarters over many years, what's your conclusion on this discussion about aid and corruption? Do you think aid can really help combat corruption, or is it irrelevant but good for other reasons, or irrelevant and bad because it can't help the fight against corruption?
Thanks, Jeff. Before I come to that particular question of yours, let me sort of backtrack a little bit and look at the base question, as you put it. Should we give aid to countries whose governments are corrupt? My answer to that question is an emphatic yes. It's an unequivocal yes. In other words, I'm saying that we should, by we I mean Australians, by we I mean donors, we should give aid to countries whose governments are corrupt. I would go even further by suggesting that the poor, unfortunate enough to be living in countries with corrupt governments, deserve aid more than their counterparts who happen to be living in countries with clean governments. And by the way, the majority of the recipients of aid are classified as being corrupt on whatever measure you want to use, including the one that Jane talked about. So we don't have to go out looking for corrupt governments. And there is obviously a huge overlap between countries that have a lot of poor and countries which have corrupt governments. There's a huge overlap. It's nearly one and the same thing. Now, let's leave the discussion on the causation between corruption and poverty aside for today. I want to tell you why. I want to give you 3 reasons, at least 3 reasons, why I think we should give aid to countries that have corrupt governments. My first reason is a very simple one. All of them are fairly simple. The poor suffer the poor in countries led by corrupt officials already suffer as a result of having those corrupt governments. I don't see donors sort of actually adding to their plight. So just for that one reason, I would argue that these poor actually deserve assistance. They are victims of their own governments. Let us not blame them as victims. They don't choose to have corrupt governments. Thus, donors, I don't think, should actually add to their predicament by starving them of aid or assistance. But also remember, the role of governments are that of intermediation. They intermediate aid from you, from the donors, to their poor. And if they fail in intermediating aid from you to the poor, and think of the poor as being the citizens of the planet, first and foremost. I mean, ahead of being citizens of their sovereign nations. Because remember, sovereignty is basically lines drawn on the planet. But to begin with, the poor are the citizens of the planet. And if their governments are failing in providing them, in channeling the aid to their poor from you, then I think there is a responsibility for all of us to actually try and reach the poor, through alternative channels. And there are alternative channels. I think some of these are already being tried. So the answer to the question on whether we should give aid to countries whose governments are corrupt is a yes. But the bigger question is, how do you get to the poor? How do you reach them? And very quickly, I keep saying if these governments don't deliver, bugger them. Sort of get around them and get to the poor more directly. And I think that can be done. So the challenge is, how do you reach the poor in countries that have corrupt governments? I would say the challenge for donors is in devising mechanisms to deliver aid to the poor, taking into account that most of these countries where they will be operating will have corrupt governments. So let us not say this is an exception. The issue is that most of the recipient governments will be corrupt by one measure or the other. In fact, by TI's measure, of the 178 countries that they collect data on perceptions of corruption, 3/4 of them, 3/4 of these countries fail in terms of their ranking between 0 and 10, they get a ranking below 5. And the majority of them who fail are the countries that are recipients of aid. So how do you get to the poor in these countries? Well, the quick answer would be to go via international non-government organizations, alluded to earlier on. World Vision, I think, has been a favorite of mine, but there's Red Cross, there's MSF, there's quite a few others. Yeah, all of them. Okay, yeah, sure. The other is to go through local non-government organizations. One of my favorites, and I happen to be from Fiji, as you know, is the Women's Crisis Center, which has been doing some marvelous work. It just so happens that the lady who's running it happens to be a good friend of mine. So I'm suggesting you don't believe everything I say about her, but I think she has been quite effective. But then thirdly, and this is probably more subtle than the first two, I said NGOs, local and international. The third is this. We may label a government as being corrupt. Choose your most corrupt government. But I think it's too broad a brush to taint an entire government as being corrupt. If you look very closely at governments which are tainted as being corrupt, you always find some bits of government which are pretty clean. I think of Papua New Guinea. I think of Nigeria. I think of my friends. Again, I know these guys. Nuhu, who was the commissioner for the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. Nuhu used to be a colleague of mine at the Center of Global Development until last year. These guys literally face bullets, assassination attempts, in trying to push the course of good governance. And Jeff, coming back to your question, can we use aid to help combat corruption? I'm saying let's be smart and look at these clean bits and reward them. So one, we help them push what they're taking lead on by themselves. But two, you also provide disincentives to the other corrupt arms of government to clean their act. Pardon the pun, but they have an incentive then to clean their act. So again, I'm saying we can use aid to help those bits of government that are clean and provide incentives for others to join that club. So it can be done quite smartly. So I think the role of donors is more to be clever rather than lazy in thinking about shutting the valve of aid off. Let me give you a concrete example. So far I've been talking very much conceptual. Let me use a very concrete example where I think this has succeeded. And this should be familiar to you guys. Again, another favorite of mine is the Fred Hollows Foundation, established by late Professor Fred Hollows. Fred sort of was a surgeon. He was an eye surgeon, used to operate on cataract. He established this foundation. Fred is no longer there, but the family sort of pushes this. The foundation does exceptionally good work. And what do? They actually work towards preventing blindness. In the main, they go out and operate on the eyes, giving people eyesight. There's sort of 3 lessons out of the work that Fred Foundation has been doing, or the Hollows Foundation has been doing. First, they're looking at fairly low-cost, simple approaches to assisting the poor. The operations on each blind person to give them eyesight costs about $25 on average, $25 per person. And it gives you eyesight. So you could imagine it's a fairly low cost with extremely high value. I mean, how would you sort of price getting back your eyesight? So again, you're sort of looking at something pretty simple rather than being trying to be too fancy if you want to reach the poor. 2, it's extremely well targeted. The people who will wait for the foundation to come and do the operation are invariably going to be the poor and the people who need that eyesight. I could imagine none of you would volunteer to have your eyes operated upon unless if you needed that support. So again, it's extremely well targeted. And if the great leader volunteers to have his cataract removed by the foundation, why not? It costs $25, and I'm pretty sure the value for that effort will be a lot more than $25. My third sort of lesson out of the Fred Hollows Foundation is that it is fairly transparent. So you can count. In the last 5 years, they have done about 750,000 surgeries, restored eyesight of the majority of these folks. And the last one, this is the most important. If you're looking at aid, you want to sort of provide a helping hand rather than a handout. You don't want to have a handout where people are dependent on the handout forever. Imagine giving somebody eyesight. It is a one-off. You're not going to be doing this every year when you come back. But you are getting this particular individual on their feet. And again, I think there are lessons out of how you could reach the poor, how you could design strategies, models of delivering assistance which are robust to the sort of environments you operate in. Not just in terms of corruption, but more broadly, not having infrastructure, not having clean water, not being able to reach these folks, not being able to separate out the needy from the ones who are pretending to be needing assistance. Again, I think donors have to be much smarter, much cleverer in terms of designing mechanisms so as to overcome these problems of corruption.
Thank you very much. Very, I think, very comprehensive analysis of the issue, which leads me straight into my question for Matt. Satish talked about NGOs. We can go around governments through NGOs to try to address issues in the communities. You worked, of course, in NGOs in India. What was your experience? What conclusions did you reach from that work about the ability of the NGO sector to make a big difference when you're working within a framework where there's a lot of corruption?
Yeah, I think I'm interested by the question here where, should we give aid to countries whose governments are corrupt? As Satish pointed out, if we answered no to that question, we wouldn't be giving much aid. So it's more a question of how we work in the context of corruption in a way that's constructive. And working as I did with several Indian NGOs, I remember very early on in the time when I was working in India, I've been there in several capacities, but this is as an aid worker. I remember I went and bought something and I forgot to get a receipt. I went and when I was asked to sort of like account for the money, the finance guy just sort of shook his head as though, you know, this was sort of like, what are we going to do about this? And I remember I had to go to the chief executive or the head, the kind of the director of the organisation to explain how I had failed to get a receipt for probably an expense of $50. But that's, in a context of corruption, they're really big issues. You know, there's a worrying aspect to all that. I remember, you know, even getting an advance to do any work, it was like you were being, you know, grilled, like you were, you know, sort of being treated as a criminal for taking the money. And so within organisations, it's a big issue, and I think quite a debilitating one. And I think one of the big dangers for any agency involved in development, whether it's a small NGO right up to AusAid or the World Bank or whatever, is that it makes people risk averse. You know, one of the things about development is it's dealing with really complicated issues where often challenging people who are powerful. You need to be bold, but if you're worrying about whether someone thinks you're corrupt, it makes you very risk averse and worried that you shouldn't do anything. I was involved with an NGO that tried to, a national NGO that tried to sort of decentralise its work, but they found it didn't operate very successfully because when they empowered guys down the tree, they didn't want to do anything with the money because they might be seen to have been corrupt. So it's a really big problem within development agencies, and as they move out into the community, of course, it's a really big issue. I can remember dealing with an Indian official who was wanting a bribe, and I thought, well, I'll ask his name. He said, "I am Mr. Happy. You will make me happy, I will make you happy." So that's the sort of thing you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. It does wear you down. I think another point that I'd make is working in NGOs, I saw a lot of very courageous responses to the problem of corruption. I can remember I had a friend who was working in a very remote part of India, and he had to get a signature for a certain, I can't remember the details now, it was a fair while ago, but he needed a signature from a senior official, and he knew that if he went there he'd have to pay some bribe. So what he did was he went and asked for the signature. Sure enough, he was turned away. So what he did was he just took all his work that he needed for the next few days, he went and just sat in the guy's office and went on with his work. It was reading, it was paperwork and everything. It took 2 days, but finally he got the signature. I remember a very frustrated colleague of mine, his name was Stephen King, I can't forget his name, but an Indian NGO guy, and he was so frustrated because I remember one of his jobs was he was coordinating a big cyclone rehabilitation program where they were rebuilding housing that had been knocked down by a cyclone in Andhra Pradesh in India. And he told me the story of when they received all the steel bars that were going to be used for reinforcing the concrete in the housing, he'd count them on the back of the truck, and somehow by the time they got to the place, there'd be 2 missing. He just was pulling out his hair, and he was so frustrated by this because he was trying so hard. It was such a difficult task. There's lots of other great examples that I could give you of NGO workers, I guess, struggling with this issue. And one of the things I noticed in my other life as a journalist working in India, I reported on a lot of work being done by NGOs. And again, corruption kept coming up as an issue. And I've seen a really healthy shift, I think, in NGO work in general, in India in particular, away from, I guess, service delivery, which was never going to be sustainable, to a much more of an advocacy role. Let me give you an example. When I was reporting on a fantastic project in the centre of India in Madhya Pradesh, and a little NGO called Spandan. Now, they didn't do any work in terms of delivering aid. All they did was research. They were an NGO that had a lot of experience doing that kind of service delivery, but they decided what they were going to do is research. In the particular district where they worked, there was a lot of hunger-related death. So this is a terrible outcome in a country with as much resources and a state as powerful as the Indian government. And so what they did was, they did a really good comprehensive research project in one little kind of district, and they took that research to the collector. That's the sort of the senior official in the district. And they also identified how corruption in various levels was contributing to the fact that children were dying in this district. And of course, the collector thanked them for their research and did nothing about it. So the next thing that they did was they took it to their friend who was an editor of the Hindustan Times in Delhi. And so, sure enough, it got published on the front page of the Hindustan Times, and all of a sudden, things started to happen in the district. Now, the thing I thought was very powerful about that is what they were doing was holding the government to account for what they said they'd do. I mean, my understanding is it's a constitutional right in India to have food. And so all they were doing was asking governments to deliver what they said they would do. And that also challenged corruption along the way, because one of the reasons for that not happening was because of leakages, as they say, in the system. So I think NGOs not only have an important challenge in terms of dealing corruption within their own within the agency, they need to overcome the challenge of being risk averse because of the threat of corruption. But then they also have a very positive role, I think, especially in their advocacy capacity, to make a real difference in this particular area.
Well, I think each of our guests has given us a good flavour of some of the important issues. Hatifa has talked, I think, about aid as an anti-corruption device in and of itself, where we're helping with the corruption commissions in various countries. We're working with government agencies to improve their financial systems, for example, so that corruption can be uncovered within government departments, etc. We've also seen an argument about how NGOs can go around corruption and still deliver to the poor and make sure that benefits flow through to the broader communities, even in a context of corruption. We've seen transparency. The journalists out there providing stories about what's really happening, Transparency International studying the subject. We've had a discussion also of the gender implications and the relationship between corruption and the inequalities faced by women in many of these communities. So I think we've got plenty of food for thought. What I'd like to do now is to invite questions from the audience. But perhaps while you're thinking about asking a question, and we have the microphones there available for you, I'd like to follow up on Hatifa's point about, Australia, for example, working with agencies within Indonesia to improve the accountability systems, to bring in ethical standards commissioners and to see how they can work. Are there any other things that governments can do to tackle corruption through aid itself rather than to avoid corruption in delivering aid to people? Joanna, have you, from your experience, are these things effective where aid agencies link up with government departments and try to improve their standards? As Satish says, there's always some good people there who they can work with.
Look, I think one of the most obvious examples of ways that we work to be our best in these settings and contexts is an example of codes of conduct that we all subscribe to. The Australian Council for International Development, of which IWDA and many other Australian NGOs are members, we really are we're beholden to a code of conduct through choice, but it is a code of conduct that enables accreditation in the first place, that gives us access to a relationship with the Australian Government's International Development Assistance, AusAid. So we have our own mechanisms about doing things right for the right reasons before we even begin. And I think that once you start to apply codes of conduct, regardless...
You're asking the right questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's from headquarters right through to engagement with communities at a village or district level. It applies in all levels of programming, and it really helps you to have a sort of mindset around behaviours and attitudes and information and decision making and allocations that exposes very, very quickly what is real and what is not real at that community level. And I think that's just a good example. Codes of conduct are a very good premise upon rules and behaviours to which we should all adhere.
Those microphones are still free. We're waiting for someone. Jane, would you like to add? Does Transparency International go further than just trying to make things transparent, or does it have programs to work within countries on anti-corruption?
I think you probably would find that most of the national chapters in each of the countries, and most of the developing countries actually do have national chapters, try and work quite closely with government to try and actually improve or encourage them to either increase the resourcing for particular anti-corruption commissions that are in place, or put in place the appropriate processes. And countering to that as well is that there's certainly a desire to try and engage more closely with a lot of private companies that are proposing to invest in those countries, saying, well, we want you to put these processes in place to make sure you try and rebuff any attempts to request payments by corrupt officials.
Now, we've got some questions. I'll start with this one on this side, and then I'll go across to that side.
Okay,
sorry. Can the lights go down a little bit so we can...
Hi, yeah, sorry. I just had a question of your opinion. What do you think of corruption being related to almost a simple issue of scale and size, that transparency is difficult when you've got governments that are such a huge institution compared to NGOs, which, like we've heard from some of you, that NGOs offer more transparent practices, but could this just be that they're in a smaller scale and that's more manageable, like finances and the monitoring of finances is more manageable on a smaller scale compared to governments that are such huge institutions?
Satish, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, that's an easy one to answer. Look, you could argue either way. One, you could say if you're small, then it's easier to track all of your finances, but you could equally argue that if you're large, then you have economies of scale in terms of having the mechanisms in place, having the computers, the audit stuff and so on. You have large enough to be able to see through each one of those expenditures. The basic argument would be that in each of these cases, even if you're a very large organization like a government, you can split that up into those chunks that are just the optimum size to be able to take advantage of whatever infrastructure is available to give you the sort of accountability you want at minimum cost. Let me give you another specific example. Think of the days when the computers were not there. You had to do everything on accounts and so on. Then your argument of having a small size would probably go through, but if you had a large organization, you want to chunk them up in this small size which are manageable. But in the current era where a lot of it is driven by computers and software, where you can have a paper trail, etc., the minimum efficient size would be much larger than the size you would have where you had hard copy book entries and so on. So going back to your question on, is size an issue? I don't think so. I think whatever the size may be, you can chunk it up so as to make it optimum in terms of tracking through all of those expenditures. And there's no correlation between the size of an organization and the extent of corruption. If you just do a basic correlation, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
Very good.
Okay, great.
Next question.
Hi, I'm a recipient of aid, so I'm here on AusAid Scholarship, and I'm from Nepal, so I have faith in it. And my answer to that question is definitely yes, I agree. My question is to Satish again, and it's a follow-up on the previous question. What I've seen happen in Nepal is exactly what you said earlier, is the lack of accountability from the government. So the donors shifted their funding from towards the government to the civil society. So since 1990 in Nepal, what's happened is the civil society has sort of blossomed, and we don't have a specific data for it, but the estimate is that we have around 30,000 NGOs. So in terms of scale, there is this notion in the civil society that there's dollar farming going on, and the function of civil society is sort of has a more corrupted personality than the government. And it's like, are we creating a parallel, even more corrupt structure? So my question to you about that.
Yeah.
And then I'll go to Atifa on that as well. So first of all, Satish. Yep.
That is an excellent question. That's a very, very good question. The answer, again, should be quite intuitive. What you're talking about is not so much size, but fragmentation. So if you have these parallel mechanisms created and too many parallel mechanisms created such that you actually have diseconomies of scale, then you create opportunities for leakage, for corruption. Again, let me give you, I do math, so let me give you a very simple equation on where you would expect corruption to take place. Corruption would happen if you had rent, gift, and aid is a gift, or say mineral resources and so on, present in abundance, with a lot of discretion, and in an environment where there's minimal accountability. Put those three things together, gift plus discretion, less accountability, you're going to get corruption. Okay? And the solution is very simple. So looking at fragmentation as well, you want to sort of address each one of them. You want to take away the gift component, you want to reduce the amount of discretion, and you want to raise accountability if you want to have a handle on sort of dampening corruption. I hope that answers your question.
Can the donor agencies, do they have the capacity to do that? Like with so many organizations, like with the government it's different because it's a big block there, but with all these like 30,000 NGOs, how does it like something like AUSAID, how do they even keep track of
keep your problem simple. What you want is marginal improvements. You won't have a leap in a day to a perfect system. But what you want is do those things so as to move it forward. Looking at sort of fragmentation as an issue, you want to address that as fragmentation rather than as corruption. So go back to my very simple equation. You want to sort of look at gift, accountability, and discretion, and sort of address each one of them. If on top of that you're having many parallel mechanisms which are creating fragmented sort of bureaucracy, and in the process sort of clouding out the sort of accountability you want, then you want to address that more directly rather than through indirect channels as through the government.
Hatifa, civil society in Indonesia.
It's very interesting to explain here that in Indonesia we have like quite strong civil society, but the numbers as well as capacity is just not enough. I mean, to resolve or overcome our development programs. So I myself think that the best role that the civil society plays is to promote like an innovative and alternative ways of development. And finally, the government have to adopt, or to adopt the things that is work, for development. Let me give you an example. I started my work in NGOs as a researcher, and in 1992, it's very difficult to take corruption issues as a subject for study. So I have to find another terms, like I'm studying small-scale enterprises, and I want to see how much the government, like an illegal levies, you call it pungutan in Indonesia. It's not corruption, but I'm studying how much money or how many percent that the small businesses have to pay before they start business, something like that. And the NGOs, they can promote and try to advocate this issue. But finally, without any change in national and as well as local regulations, it's very difficult for us to resolve this problem. So study is good, by NGOs, but we need also something from the legislature or from the government to make sure that what NGOs think and our research result is taken in a policy. And we also try to assist local governments, but NGOs, we can only work with 5 or 10 local governments, and in Indonesia we have hundreds, more than 500 local governments. So it takes you years and years, because in a year I can maybe go to 5 places to support them intensively, not more than 5 regions. So that is why I think it's very good if NGOs, activists can go to as a decision makers, so that they can use their experience to change the policy. But I can tell you in hours and hours, how difficult for us to influence policies, especially if it involves corruption and vested interest of any members in the parliament.
Just before we go to, you finished? Sorry, just before we go to the next one, Joan, you wanted to add a comment there?
Just a very minor comment as well. One of the things that we found, or Transparency International has found rather interesting, is the fact that as aid or donors have actually cracked down on the government side and are actually trying to improve or address corruption in terms of aid money that's provided, some of the corrupt officials have actually left to set up NGOs in hope of being recipients of some of the money that's given to the countries through the NGO process. And so there's certainly, I think a lot of donors are encouraged to conduct a due diligence prior to actually giving money to the NGO, and as you say, making sure they have a proper processes in place to account for the money that's actually provided.
And Matt, you were going to add something?
I was going to refer to the very interesting case of Bangladesh, where you've got some of the biggest NGOs in the world have emerged because donors have decided to not go to the government because of corruption issues, and they've created these massive institutions, BRAC, Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee. I think it's got a different name now, but that's what it started as. And Grameen, of course, the famous microfinance organisation. You know, if you go to Bangladesh, you can get a Grameen mobile phone. They're one of the biggest mobile phone providers in the country. BRAC has a bank and a university. You know, these are massive organisations. I think BRAC's annual budget is well over $500 or $600 million. The problem I see there is, though, that they are almost like parallel states. They're delivering so many basic services, education, health, you know, livelihood projects and the like. And the problem there, I think, is that it's actually, you know, I don't think it's very constructive for a country to have these parallel massive organisations that are substituting for what the state should do. I don't know how you'd get around it, but it seems to me a sort of unsustainable process.
Okay, next question.
My question is regards to conditionality with democracy. A lot of governments and NGOs say, we will give if you are democratic, but yet corruption still seems to flourish, regardless if there's democracy or non-democracy. What are your thoughts on that?
Who'd like to have a crack at that? Well, obviously, Hatif has already made the point that Indonesia's gone democratic, but corruption still exists in that country.
In Pakistan, for example, I mean, I remember talking to a Pakistani politician who said, it costs this much to get a seat, and I've got to raise the money. And that's just what happens, because I've got to pay these many people to come out and vote, I've got to pay these many people to go and organise everyone, I've got to give lunch to all the people and, you know, chai and a cup of tea and water to the voters, all this sort of stuff. It was a huge amount of money, and that was the price of a seat. If you didn't spend that money, you had no chance. It's interesting, Imran Khan, the cricketer turned political firebrand, one of his big things is that I've just refused to take part in this corrupt system. He's hardly won a seat. So, you know, there's a really important issue there, that the way that democracy has panned out in some countries where it's sort of, there's cultural kind of disjuncture with the way that system works. They're not Western, you know, kind of countries where we had hundreds of years to develop, you know, liberal democracy.
Joanna, and then Satish.
You know, I think democracy is a tricky word. I think let's not draw lines between development programs and aid delivery in some parallel with democracy. That would be another One Just World Forum, I suspect. But I think in terms of the context of tonight, we're thinking around democracy in terms of transparency and ability and equitability. So for me, I think, you know, governance is like a matter of demand and supply and a country's response to that. And for that to be equitable, for that to be transparent, for that to be democratic, it's much more than about how just a government performs. It's not just about the government, it's about the ability for all citizens within a nation to be both accountable and to call on accountability of other citizens of that nation. And I think for that to occur, that requires both power and empowerment. And then I'm going to put the gender lens on it, and that means that both men and women have both the power and the empowerment to be able to call on each other to be accountable. And I think when you have processes like that within society, to which development programs can clearly contribute, whether it's civil society partnerships or high-level bilateral engagement around democracy and peace building or conflict resolution. I think there are lots of models of which engagement can occur. When you have that, you see a development program that is able to build accountability and the ability for citizens to participate in what they believe is right in terms of governance that addresses the needs and priorities of those nations.
Satish?
Just quickly, adding on to what Joe was saying, I was going to say part of that, because remember, the donor funds provided are from democracies and they want accountability. So in this particular context, you're looking at accountability. But more broadly, development, if sustained over time, actually leads to demands for democracy. I have a paper on this looking at Indonesia under Suharto. Suharto, when he had come into power in 1965, he had promised quite explicitly, he had promised development, but he said no democracy. And Indonesia sort of sustained growth for long enough, where people became rich enough, where they then went out to demand democracy, to the extent that they were able to actually see Suharto off.
Next question.
Thanks very much. We've talked quite a bit about corruption in developing countries, but we haven't talked as much about the flip side of corruption in aid agencies themselves, or maybe not corruption, but if we want to call it lack of accountability or lack of transparency, whether that's US food aid, which gets sent to US farmers and then US trucking companies and US ships, and then US NGOs do the distribution. So that's one side, and then the other side, of course, is developed country governments, Australian government, for example. What's their responsibility for ensuring that Australian companies do not engage in these practices? So just turning the lens a little bit, and Jane, perhaps you'd like to start.
It's a very good question, and certainly with Transparency International Australia has been encouraging the Australian government to start enforcing the prohibition of bribing foreign public officials that's been in the Criminal Code Act since 1999. There have been some amendments made to it, but it certainly has not been pursued. You might be pleased to hear, perhaps, that there was the introduction of the UK Bribery Act in April last year, which will be implemented as of the 1st of July this year. And I think that's really starting to focus a lot of businesses' minds, because there are a lot of dual nationals who work for Australian companies who could be subject to that act. And certainly the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a US act and is enforced quite robustly, shall I say, by the Department of Justice and the Security Exchange Commission in the United States, is really starting to pursue that even more robustly, primarily because there's a lot of money to be made through penalties and fines imposed on companies. And so I think we'll find over the next couple of years that there will be a lot more focus on this space. And the analogy I use is about 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, occupational health and safety was something that people regarded as off to the side a little bit. And it was really as a consequence of a number of major accidents and the introduction of far more stringent legislation in the 1990s that it became centred to a lot of companies, particularly resource companies' activities. And I think we'll find that that's going to happen with anti-corruption, particularly in terms of how the private sector engage with developing countries and the governments of those countries.
How extensive is that sort of legislation now?
Developed countries.
Yeah.
It's it was derived out of the OECD Convention Against Corruption, which was actually ratified or signed and ratified in the late 1990s, and that was the process by which Australia incorporated its obligations in the Criminal Code Act in 1999. There are now, I think, about 36 countries that have actually ratified the OECD Convention and incorporated the prohibition of bribing foreign public officials into their act. Into their legislation, and the UK Bribery Act is really Britain bringing theirs up to date, because prior to that we're relying on an act that really dated back to more than a century.
Has China and India signed those?
Not, I'd have to double check that, but not as far as I know.
Because that's become an issue, of course.
Exactly.
The Chinese approach to development aid is quite different from other countries.
It is, very much so.
And trying to get one set of standards when the Chinese go their own way is very difficult.
It's very, very difficult.
Right, next question.
Great. Thanks for that talk. It was very enlightening. I have certain issues with regards to poverty and corruption in the world, and I'm glad that this talk was staged today, because I have been doing a couple of case studies on a couple of countries in hand that just like Burma has the same ratio, has reduced standards of living, has a huge problem. There's a big difference between the rich and the poor. There are huge issues with medical welfare. There's the sexualization of girls with marketing campaigns. There are laws that ultimately derive from English colonial law, keep fathers from their children in custody, and the banks have a role that send people more in debt. And what's really interesting is this ratio to military and health that you mentioned with Burma. Is this one of these countries is right up there. And one of the most important things is bipartisan politics, where sponsorship is a way of life. So in the parliament, to give money out of a favour is actually a way of life. And it's actually what the Romans and Greeks despised of the barbarians when they took Rome, and they developed their own image of civilization. So, I mean, what are we going to do with the corruption and poverty in the UK and America?
What about this general question, therefore, of a culture of corruption that goes right through the society? What do we know about this, Satish? I mean, is this, as opposed to corruption at the levels of government, where the whole society is based upon, if you give me something, I'll give you something, and there's no other way of looking at the world?
I'm lost, to be honest.
Yeah. Joe, would you like to?
I think that sort of reflects what I was trying to say before. I think that's where we have, there are moral codes, there are ethical codes, there are faith-based codes, there are human rights conventions. We're guided in life through regulations or legislations or conventions or cultural codes. And I truly believe that in our hearts we know what is right. Whether our culture adapts our behaviour to vested interest because that gives us some form of power is a question, but I think in the main we are moved to instances of corruption, which is, sounds like a great big word, but if I need to get healthcare for my kids, I will do what I need to do to get that. Now, is that corrupt or is that a moral obligation? And I think those are the questions. So I think only when we move into a world of a sense of accountability that calls on what is humanitarian at its basis do we start to get fairness and openness and transparency in our behaviours. And I think that comes down to a humanitarian issue, not a political issue or not an economic issue. Sadly, and I'm not just saying this because of the job I do, I say it because it is the truth of my life, so much of this is based in inequality between men and women. And I really believe that if we can see a world where women have more civil and political participation in decision-making, that we might just get a different approach to this. We might get a balance of accountabilities, and we might just get to see a little more intuitive thinking around those areas of humanity that I described. And I think there are bases here that are centred around power and vested interest. And until we shift those foundations, I don't believe we are going to solve these issues.
Time's moving on. We'll have to make this the last question, I'm afraid, but it's yours, yeah.
I'm interested in developing countries and police forces being such large public servant repositories, I suppose, and corruption within that. The police forces in developing countries, often when the police are paid very, very low wages, and stories I've heard is that they feel there's no way for them to survive unless they take bribes and behave in a corrupt manner. I'm interested to know if there are any programs being run that have had some success by working with governments in developing countries to work on that issue of corrupt police force.
Maybe I also want to respond to the previous questions. I think it's very important for us as developing countries to also learn an international standard what considered as corrupt practices or corrupt conducts. Because sometimes, we have a different mindset. For example, about bribery, we think that if you give something after your things finish, it's okay. Or what you call, like a gratification, because in our culture, if someone gives you something, it's unpolite, if you return it. And it's also important for us, especially as a member of parliament, to learn from USA, for example, or Australia, because I asked one of the member of the senators in USA, because they have very thick code of conduct. They said they put everything in there, and I asked, do you put in your code of conduct book that all members cannot go to the prostitution? They said, of course not, because without mention in the code of conduct, they will not do it, because if their constituent knows that they go to the gambling place or to the prostitution place, it will influence people's perception about them. But in Indonesia, we have our code of conduct mentioned or put that kind of issue. So we are very, if we compare, it's very interesting to understand that what considered as as good or bad may different. And the question about police, the levies, illegal levies, do by many bureaucracies, not only the police. So it happened everywhere since you give birth your children. To get the paper, you have to pay, and until you go to the grave, you also have to pay to make sure that you have a proper place. So we try to make sure that the government, when they provide, or the police, when they provide their services, they have good information. They open the information to the public, and I think it creates some changes also. So if we know that we have to pay or we cannot pay for the service, because for example, if you want to have a license and you know that you have to pay only certain ₹1,000, then it will reduce the possibility of corrupt practices in bureaucracy. Or maybe you can change the way the operating procedures and different kind of efforts to make sure that that possibility will reduce. I think you can change that things. It's not something that cannot be changed. It can.
Perhaps I'd ask Satish, actually, is there any evidence on, radical approaches to deregulation that remove a lot of parts of a process of licence giving in order to reduce corruption by reducing the chances of someone being in a position where they can ask for money? Are these campaigns of getting rid of a whole lot of licensing, do they work? Do we have evidence on this?
Yeah, in fact, the World Bank is doing a huge amount of work on looking at cost of doing business in developing countries, where the question being asked is that if we take away all of those licenses, the applications, the regulatory controls, does it make easier for doing business in these countries, or does it make it harder? I think deep down you have to remember that there is a reason for these regulations. It's supposed to make things easier. Now, you could go overboard and have too many regulations which actually make things hard. So presumably there is some balance where just enough regulation facilitates enterprise, innovation, production, but too much could actually impede the same. But let me come back to your question. Just remember this. Corruption is a zero zero-sum game. Let me explain. If I steal $1 from you, and corruption is theft in a kind, sort of non-violent manner. If I take $1 away from you, you have $1 less. Whether I do it through robbery or corruption, it's a zero-sum game. So my gain is your loss. But there's more. It is actually a negative sum game if you look over time. If you have a lot of robbery, a lot of theft, a lot of corruption, it erodes those incentives for production, for innovation. So if you know that the product, the fruits of your labor would be taken away from you, you have a disincentive to actually produce. And you could end up in a situation, again looking at police, you could end up in a situation where you have too much of policing, where the police start to predate rather than produce. And the predation then leads to less production, which then leads to more aggressive predation. And the feedback could end up in a war, in sort of total poverty. And we have seen this happen in several places. But the same could happen the opposite way, where if you just have enough protection of the right to property and person, particularly over time, where your fruits of labor you could reap the benefits of, then you could have a situation where you have more production, which leads to less incentives to predate, which means still more production. So you have this virtuous effect. Where has this happened? For the last year, I have been working in Bougainville, for those of you who know Bougainville, where Bougainville was in a civil war, basically a fight over distribution of rents from a mine. That's where it started, but the history is much longer than that. Peacekeepers went in and provided a window of peace. So there was a 10-year war, 10-year conflict, which was brought to an end in December 1997. Peacekeepers were there until 2003, so 6 years, okay? And the window of peace was enough to switch that vicious circle of predation leading to less production, leading to more predation, to actually reverse itself, where the window of peace provided the opportunity to produce, where people got attracted into production, which meant less predation. And I think they are on the way out. In fact, I'm giving a paper on this in Melbourne on Friday, where I talk about the nexus between peace and prosperity. So, yes, police have a role. It's just trying to provide enough space so that people have security to their person and to property, to give them the space to produce, such that you have this virtuous effect of production on prosperity, on peace. Yeah, and all of us want to live in a peaceful society. So, this is not doing good for somebody else. This is all enlightened self-interest. It's in our interest that we don't have too much predation in our own communities.
Thank you very much. I think we've had some wonderful commentary, and I thank the audience for the questions. I'll now give each of our panellists a chance to say one more thing before we leave tonight's event. They're only allowed one sentence, and there will be a ruthless imposition of law and order around that. So who would like to give their sentence first? Matthew.
Yeah, okay, I'll start. One sentence. Look, I'd just say that in the context of events in the last few weeks where the head of the IMF has got into all sorts of trouble, one of the things I'd like us to not be careful about is it can sometimes seem like white guys telling others what to do, and corruption can be interpreted in many ways. And I think I'd like to emphasise how I've seen lots of very courageous challenges to corruption in developing countries, and it would be wrong to stereotype all communities as being very corrupt and us being very good.
Yeah, mine is just one sentence and a short one. It says, the challenge for donors is to devise assistance mechanisms that work in poorly governed environments. Full stop.
The challenge is out, Joe.
Most people
One
know
sentence?
I'm not very good at one sentences. Should we give aid to countries where governments are corrupt? Yes. as long as we can find a mechanism by which our activities are judged that includes the voice and participation of men and women equally.
Excellent. Jane?
I'm going to leave the last sentence to a colleague of mine who was on the board of TI Papua New Guinea, who, when in responding to somebody saying that it's not corruption, it's part of culture, said it's always the most educated who hide behind the mask of corruption, or hide behind the mask of culture.
Yeah, finally, low salary cannot become a reason for us to become corrupt. One more sentence, please. Because I'm coming from far away. Yeah. Please give me more. I think we need good leadership to give an example, but more importantly, we need good example, and we can receive that from developed countries like yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the 34th forum in a national series looking at key development issues affecting us as members of the global community. One Just World is about two things. It's about giving you an opportunity to hear expert views, and I'm certain that tonight we've facilitated that. And secondly, it gives you a chance to think about what you can do to build a more just and equitable future for everyone. Now, there are tables in the foyer where you can get information about a variety of programs that are run in many parts of the world, and I encourage you to stop by and have a chat with the people at those tables. They'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And there are also some forms on your seats which encourage you to put forward ideas to us that we might be able to follow up on because, you know, we're interested in this being very much a feedback forum. But on behalf of One Just World, can I thank our guests? Hatifa, who's come from Indonesia. It's always great to get our friends from Indonesia, a huge country going through dramatic change, a vigorous country, and the friendship they've shown to Australia over many years, I think we all appreciate. And Hatifa's presence here tonight, I think indicates the commitment that she has and others have in Indonesia to good relations between our two countries. Thank you very much. And could I also thank Jane, Satish, Matt and Joe for joining us this evening. We've got a variety of contributions. I think just about all of the angles that we could have taken up, I'm pretty sure were covered tonight. I'm sure some of the questioners would have found a few more there if they'd had a chance, and I apologise that we just had so many people here tonight that we couldn't let everyone ask a question. The video will be available on the One Just World website within the next week or so. In fact, you can watch all of the forums, all 34 of them, close to all of those forums are now available on the web. Also, take the evaluation forms that are on your seats, register your name or do so via those forms or via the website, and you'll receive an email whenever a new video is added to the website, and you'll get news about forthcoming forums. You can also add comments about the issues discussed and suggest ideas for future forums. Thank you very much for coming, and good night.